All right, let's get right into this. What we have here is a classic showdown, It's a king who's convinced his power is absolute, going head to head with his subjects who are demanding that he too has to follow the law. This is the story of the Magna Carta, a real collision between total power and ancient freedoms. So, our story kicks off in a pretty unimpressive place, honestly. We're in the year 1215 at a spot called Runnymede. It's basically just a soggy field west of London. But this place, this little patch of land, is about to become the stage for one of the most important negotiations in the history of the world. And this really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? Because, spoiler alert, the Magna Carta was, for all intents and purposes, a total failure right out of the gate. So how on earth did this broken agreement, signed in a swampy field, become a global symbol for freedom and the rule of law? To figure that out, we have to start with the man at the center of this whole mess. We need to talk about the king and the serious problem of having unchecked power. So, meet King John. By 1215, things are not going well for him. He's disliked, he's distrusted, and he's feeling the pressure from pretty much every direction. His relationship with the barons, the most powerful nobles in England, has completely crumbled. The tension in the kingdom, it's all about him. So where did it all go wrong? Well, a lot of it came down to money. King John had just lost a really expensive war with France. And to pay for it, he started hitting people with these crippling taxes. I mean, these weren't your normal, everyday taxes. These were desperate, and they were really starting to tick people off, right when he needed their loyalty the most. And all that financial pressure, it leads straight to a full-blown rebellion. But this fight was about so much more than just who was paying for what. You see, the barons, these are the top nobles in the land, they felt like the king was walking all over something sacred, their ancient rights and liberties. King John had picked up this really bad habit of just throwing his political enemies in jail, with no trial, no questions asked. And that sent a terrifying message. The king's power had no limits at all. So they'd had enough. The barons pulled their support and went into open rebellion, and they gave the king an ultimatum. Pretty much, we can have peace, but it's going to be on our terms. King John was completely cornered. He had no other choice but to ride out to that soggy field at Runnymede and hear them out. Okay, this is where things get really interesting. The barons didn't just show up to complain. They came with a demand that was, well, it was totally revolutionary for the time. What they wanted had never been done before. They demanded a written charter, a physical, binding document that officially put limits on the king's power. They wanted to take all those unwritten rules and customs and turn them into a contract that even the king himself couldn't just ignore. And right at the heart of that demand was this one crucial line. This was the game changer. Justice shouldn't depend on what kind of mood the king is in. No, disputes had to be settled by the lawful judgment of their equals or by the law of the land. What they were really saying was, this is the end of royal whim. They were pushing for a system where the law itself was the ultimate authority, not just whatever the king felt like doing on any given day. That's a huge idea. So after a whole lot of tense back and forth, this radical idea was actually about to become real, at least on paper. And here it is. This is the moment. After all the negotiating at Runnymede, King John finally agrees and puts his royal seal on the document. And just like that, the agreement we now call the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, is born. For the very first time, the king's absolute power was being challenged by an actual binding contract. But here's the twist in the story. The peace treaty was a complete and total flop. Almost right away, King John decided he didn't like these new restrictions, and the war was back on before the ink was even dry. So if the treaty failed so miserably, what exactly are we celebrating all these centuries later? Well, it turns out the idea behind the Magna Carta was a lot tougher than the document itself. Even though the Peace of 1215 totally fell apart, the principle at its core, that survived. The Magna Carta set a precedent, an example, that would echo for hundreds of years. Even the king is not above the law. And that powerful idea, it has a name you've probably heard, the rule of law. And it's actually a pretty simple concept. It just means that everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest king, is subject to the same laws and the same legal process. That's the real legacy that started in that flooded meadow. So let's do a quick recap of how this all went down. It started with a failed war and crazy taxes that made King John really unpopular. The big complaint was him throwing people in jail without a trial, which went against their rights. The action? The barons forced the king to the negotiating table. The key demand was for justice by law, not by the king's whim. And the legacy? A failed peace treaty that, somehow, successfully planted the seed for the rule of law. So if you take one thing away from this, it should be this. The Magna Carta's real power isn't about what it achieved back in 1215. It's about the unstoppable idea it unleashed on the world, that nobody, and I mean nobody, is above the law.
Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. It's been over 800 years since King John put his seal on that parchment. So how does that simple, powerful idea that all power has to answer to the law, how does it continue to echo and shape the world we live in today?